Welcome to the IIoT World Manufacturing Day session, Emerging Use Cases and Market Structure in Industrial IoT. My name is Geoff Wylde, and I'll be your host for today's panel. If this is your first session of the day, give yourself a minute to take a look around this tool. You'll see, for example, there's a place for both chat and Q&A. Feel free to tell us where you're located. It'll be like the days of the classic late night TV show where the host wanders through the audience and asks people where they're from, except I promise not to do that. So we have a few housekeeping items, things to be aware of. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on demand at maximum 2 days after the event. We'll send a follow-up email after the event with the details. We have upcoming dates for future events. So June 16th will be IIoT World's Smart Cities Day. On August 12th, it'll be IIoT World's Energy Day. On October 6th, it'll be IIoT World's ICS Cybersecurity Day. And on December 8th, it'll be IIoT World's Manufacturing Day again. So we're taking questions at the conclusion, so please post those in the Q&A section, not in the chat, or via Twitter and LinkedIn, leveraging the hashtag IIoT World Day. This track will run for 60 minutes, and we will have you out of here on time. And it wouldn't be possible to run this virtual conference without our sponsors. So thank you to Alienta, Canvas, Eurotech, Hitachi Vantara, HiveMQ, Fortinet, Losant, Trend Micro, Ursa Leo, Vertex, and Wellaware. And I am so excited by this panel today, or this guest. First of all, it's another person who's got Geoffrey with a G. It's Geoffrey Wylde. Jeff leads the IoT-related research and projects at the World Economic Forum, the International Organization for Public-Private Cooperation. He manages the forum's pilot project, Accelerating Industrial IoT for Small and Medium-Sized Businesses, which initially launched in Brazil in 2020 and is now successfully adopted in 5 more countries and counting. He was lead author of the State of the Connected World report, recently published by the forum at the WEF website. So Jeff, welcome, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say today.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Always a pleasure to be introduced by another Jeff. So yeah, off to a great start. So I guess the first question, I often hear is, why is the World Economic Forum interested in IoT? We're most known for our annual meeting in Davos every year. And that Davos meeting started about 50 years ago. And it was very unique in that it brought together business leaders, leading thinkers from academia and technology, as well as political figures, to work on some of the most pressing social and economic challenges facing the world. And that created a really unique network for the forum to create change in the world. And based off of that unique network of academics and politicians, business leaders, we're able to tackle some of the world's most pressing challenges, including those related to IoT. And so my job is really focused on that. I just want to make sure that I can share my screen next. Wonderful. So the team I work on is called the Platform for Shaping the Future of the Internet of Things in Urban Transformation. And our team was really born out of the founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab's book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And Professor Schwab wrote that the changes are so profound that from the perspective of human history, there's never been a time of greater promise or potential peril. And thinking about that potential peril and how to capture that promise as it relates to 4IR technology, a number of teams were set up, mostly based in San Francisco, although with a footprint around the world, to address the idea of technology governance, ensure that we're heading towards that promise and steering away from that peril. Our guiding framework is around governance gaps. And the way to think about this is that the change from technology is happening at an exponential rate. And with that exponential rate of change comes risks or potential opportunity, social impact. And IoT is on this exponential curve. On the other hand, our social institutions that govern how we work, you could think about our political systems or economic systems, they're much harder to change. They change at a much slower rate. And so you can think that the maturity of our governance systems currently lag behind this pace of technological change. And that delta, that difference is what we're calling these governance gaps. And my team focuses on those gaps specifically in IoT and what we can do to close them, how we can speed up the change of governance to catch up with the speed of change of technology. And COVID has only increased that speed of change. Prior to the global pandemic, projections for IoT growth were still quite robust. What we saw last year is that across IoT as a whole, we saw a slowdown of adoption, but there were some real bright spots, obviously, that bucked that trend. Things like proximity detection or wearable devices being used to detect illness, hospital applications, infrared thermal imaging, using FLIR cameras and that kind of thing to detect people who may be getting ill. Those were some bright spots around IoT growth. However, overall, the industry slowed down. This was a combination of supply chain disruption, slowdown in demand and industrial output, those kinds of drivers that kind of slowed the whole industry. However, our perspective at the World Economic Forum is that coming out of COVID, we're going to see an acceleration of IoT adoption faster than what we anticipated in 2019 before the COVID pandemic. The reasons behind that are multiple. One of them is around social acceptance of technology. Many more people are working from home. There's increased technology literacy. So there's a real social acceptance. The other is that we've proven the need for building resilient and automated systems, trying to keep people safe, distanced from their operations at work. All of that culminates in a driver for IoT adoption. We may go into that a little bit further in today. People want to dig into that. So the upshot of all of this is that we're going into a world where a post-COVID world where IoT is going to be even more prevalent than we thought it was going to be. That brings with it a number of risks. Now, the next few slides I'm going to show are based off of some research that the forum conducted, published in December, called the State of the Connected World Report. We surveyed about 400 IoT experts around the world across different domains, consumer, government in smart cities, and then obviously relevant to this audience, the industrial and enterprise IoT space. And broadly, what we found in terms of risk may not be surprising to the audience. That is that the highest level of risk perceived from IoT was around privacy and trust, and safety and security. That was especially true in the consumer IoT space. In industrial, safety and security was higher than privacy and trust, but interoperability was also seen as a pretty significant risk. We looked at the governance measures to deal with those risks. What kind of tools does government, industry associations, and businesses themselves implement to try to mitigate these kinds of risks? I might even argue that the industrial IoT world as a sort of conference here is part of the governance landscape. We're creating more awareness, increasing dialogue against some of these issues. And in particular, I think I've seen a lot of sessions today on things like interoperability and system architecture and economic viability as well. So these discussions coming out of IoT world or industrial IoT world are really addressing some of the governance challenges we're seeing here. And what the World Economic Forum found is that while these two areas of major risk, safety and security, privacy and trust, while they are the highest risk, that also means that we're seeing a lot of governance action in that space. Safety and security, things like cybersecurity standards, NIST has been publishing standards in this space for quite a while. The UK has published cybersecurity standards, and then within certain industries, you go even further. I've been working recently with the aviation industry, for instance, and ICAO, the UN's body for aviation, civil aviation authorities, has been working very closely to safety and security in their space. In privacy and trust, you see something similar. There's regional laws that govern this in the US, things like the California Consumer Privacy Act. Illinois obviously has a similar kind of legislation. I've seen recently Senator Amy Klobuchar has introduced new legislation around protecting consumer health privacy. So there's in the US, there's a robust body of policy dealing with privacy and trust. Obviously, in the EU, GDPR has sort of set the global standard. But it's not just on governments to set privacy and trust governance. You also see a lot of industry taking action on this. This could be things like internal policies being put in place by businesses, industry standards, academic groups. I know Carnegie Mellon, for example, has been doing some fantastic research on improving consumer privacy, and industry organizations like Consumers International that are trying to protect individual privacy. Now, this has a slightly different nuance when we're talking about the industrial IoT space that would be relevant to our audience here. Privacy in the context of industrial IoT is often around how much sensitive commercial data do I want to share with the supplier. In one example of a case study from that I'll go into in a little bit, we heard from a small and medium-sized industrial supplier in the automotive supply chain. They were concerned that introducing more in IoT into their operations might give their customers increased visibility over their operations, and they'd use that to drive down margin. So in industrial IoT, privacy can have a very real financial and economic impact. Now, when we compare these governance risks versus governance measures over the last couple slides, we can kind of measure what we're calling our governance gap that I introduced at the top of this presentation. And given that there are governance measures in place for safety and security and privacy and trust to mitigate some of the risk there, we find a really interesting outcome from this analysis. And that is that the risks related to social benefit and equity, ensuring that IoT is accessible and becomes a force for shared societal benefit, as opposed to exacerbating existing inequities. That actually is what we identified as the largest single gap for governance in IoT. And this is really important, not just in the consumer space or in the government space, but also in the industrial space. So I'm going to go into a case study of a project that the World Economic Forum has worked on over the last number of years to bring this to life a little bit further. Why closing governance gaps and why addressing inequities is important for the industrial IoT landscape. The kernel of this research starts with this chart. And the upshot from this is that small businesses are on average 6 times less likely than large businesses to use industrial IoT. In this case, defined as big data from enterprise smart devices or sensors. And so what this is showing is there's real evidence that small businesses are much less likely to use industrial IoT and kind of enjoy the benefits of increased productivity, efficiency, safety, and security that industrial IoT can bring. Now, the question is, why does that matter? Why does it matter that big businesses are much more likely than small businesses to use IoT? And really, the answer to that is largely economic. Small and medium-sized enterprises make up the vast majority of businesses globally. They employ the majority of workers around the world, and they contribute over half of global GDP. That matters because small and medium-sized enterprises are integral to global supply chains. They're customers and suppliers to businesses around the world, large and small. Without a productive and robust small and medium-sized enterprise base, you really risk disrupting these global supply chains that we have seen last year with COVID. And there's been a real push to find local suppliers in many supply chains. And as a result, small and medium-sized enterprises are taking advantage of some of that opportunity. But to get plugged into those global supply chains, it really helps to be leveraging the benefits of IoT. It means that you're globally competitive, and it means that you can integrate your operations along these supply chains even better. Now, the second thing is that, as I mentioned, SMEs employ the majority of workers globally. Without a productive and efficient SME base, that can lead to more unemployment or less employment opportunity. That's particularly important because there's a number of research that's been done that shows that SMEs are integral to social mobility, that without a robust small and medium-sized enterprise base, there's less employment opportunity for people at the bottom of the pyramid. SMEs bring people out of poverty. By creating a more productive, efficient, and safer SME industrial base, we're actually enabling more people to enjoy a higher quality of life. I really think that's a very admirable goal. So the forum addressed this challenge facing SMEs initially in partnership with the Ministry of Economy of Brazil to run a local policy pilot project that addressed this kind of imbalance, bringing small and medium-sized enterprises into industrial IoT. The first step to this project was building a community. We invited different government ministries. While we were initially partnered with the Ministry of Economy, we worked with the Ministry of Innovation, the National Development Bank, state level, as well as federal level agencies. The state of Sao Paulo was integral to making this happen. Really a kind of a robust partnership across different levels of government in Brazil. We work with industry organizations. We work with academic institutions, and also really critically multinational corporations to address SMEs. And this was kind of critical because, as I said earlier, industrial, large MNCs are the suppliers and customers of SMEs. They had a vested interest in bringing SMEs into the fourth industrial revolution. Examples would be like Embraer was really critical in this, or Braskem, Brazil's chemical company, or Brascel, pulp and paper, large organizations that had a vested interest in a robust SME supply base. The next step that we went about was understanding what challenges SMEs are facing with adopting industrial IoT. We did this through surveys and workshops and interviews, really a robust kind of series of fact-finding and investigation, leading us to a sort of what we would call a co-design process. We had a number of workshops with all of these different stakeholders to work together to design policy solutions for SMEs. And this was, particularly interesting because it was one of the first times that all these different ministries in Brazil at a state and local, or a state and federal level, pardon me, had collaborated to say, here's what we're doing for SMEs, hear from each other, and then package that up into a kind of policy solution that was approachable to businesses. It was also the first time that policymakers and academics and the SMEs themselves had sat in a room and talked about what they need. As a result, we were able to design a really robust set of policy tools to allow SMEs to get what they needed to adopt IoT. And we did that by launching, at first, a pilot project. Well, actually, we started with a prototype with only 10 companies, and then a pilot with 100 SMEs in Brazil. That was just a little over a year ago, and we're already at 2,000 SMEs in Brazil that have been kind of adopted into this policy program. So really rapid scaling. Now, going with a pilot, as anybody here from an IoT perspective would know, is helpful because you get feedback. You get to test your hypotheses, see how your policy predictions work, and adjust as you go. And so we kind of kept this agile approach through this design in pilot phase. I hate to say that our output was a white paper, because it isn't. The output in Brazil is that we helped 2,000 companies kind of join the fourth industrial revolution. However, we also needed to document our findings somewhere. And so this white paper represents that. And what we developed was this quote unquote policy protocol, which you could think of as like a toolkit for policymakers, industry associations to do what they need to help SMEs adopt industrial IoT. And that we came up with 14 different policies, if I recall, across 4 areas. Raising awareness, providing expert support, providing crucial financial support, getting the environment to collaborate together. And these different policies addressed 5 different kind of high-level challenges that we heard from SMEs. Obviously, there's many more than this, but we've kind of clustered them into challenges relating to people and capabilities, process and infrastructure, and finally, ecosystem. I'm going to pause there on access to our data. We have contrasting situations like Apple and the request from the FBI and Ring and their integration with police departments. Interesting question. I'm going to just finish what I'm kind of speaking about here around industrial IoT. And Brett, I promise I'll come back and answer that question in just a few minutes. So back to you on that. Heading back to our pilot in Brazil, after about a year, we were able to determine some of our pilot findings. So one of them is that public support in seed funding is really critical to creating awareness around the benefits of industrial IoT for small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in middle-income countries like Brazil. However, once they get that seed funding, more than 80% of our pilot companies plan to continue investing in industrial IoT with their own money. So I think that is, like, in a nutshell, what we were able to prove here, that these SMEs need a little bit of support to just get into the game in industrial IoT. And once they get a taste, once they realize that it doesn't have to be really hard to develop or even expensive, that they're willing to continue on their IoT journey. Our most common use cases we saw were industrial process monitoring, paperless, asset tracking was really popular. Probably our was our third most common use case. This could be everything from inventory tracking to kind of fleet management. And then we had a number of agricultural companies in our pilot as well that we're implementing greenhouse monitoring. So by the numbers, kind of how did our pilot work out? Well, we assessed 105 companies for their industrial IoT maturity. About half of those went through with full pilot assistance. And we were able to bring in 29 different suppliers to that project. So really helping to kind of underwrite the ecosystem, if you will, in Brazil. And these initial deployments had a very high ROI, on average 190% ROI, payback within 4 months, and we saw OEE improvement almost across the board. So really quite compelling. I don't have a slide on this, but based off of the success of this particular pilot in Brazil, we now have 5 more countries that are going to be launching a similar program locally. So we're able to take what we did in Brazil and now scale that across the world with these 5 countries to begin with, and we're hoping to go even more than that in the future. Those 5 countries are South Africa, Colombia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Saudi Arabia. Very exciting. To get involved in any of our projects, please, we really would love to hear from you to get involved. Please email at iot@weforum.org. Now that's the end of my presentation on that particular side of things. So I'll jump into Q&A. And if there's interest from people in the audience, please just put it in chat or in the Q&A. We can also now go into some themes around how COVID is changing industrial IoT. I'd be happy to go into that. I know I just want to be conscious of time. We're half an hour into our 45-minute slot. So I'll pause there and get some questions before we go on to that next section.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That was really insightful. I actually learned a lot. Yes, we have that question from Brett. So we could start with that. And then I have a few other follow-ups. I'll just, for those who can't see it, I'll read out Brett's question. He says, hi, Geoffrey, you spoke about governance and privacy. What's your feeling on law enforcement having access to our data? We have contrasting situations like Apple and the request from the FBI and Ring and their integration with police departments.
Yeah, Brett, it's a really great question. And, at the World Economic Forum is interesting in that we, have to take the perspective of different kind of cultures, and different cultures have different kind of values as it relates to individual privacy. Now, I'm coming from a North American culture and perspective on that. And so my personal, view is that in almost all of my data should be kind of as long as it is not in the public realm, my private data should remain my private data unless I choose to disclose it into the public realm where it might become available to law enforcement. Now, if I have data that's in the public realm, so for example, my Facebook profile, or maybe even a picture of my face that's in the public realm, then, in a sense, that becomes fair game. And I think Clearview AI showed the weakness or the potential fragilities of having all of this public data available on us, and how, they were developing a tool that law enforcement could use for facial recognition. And obviously, facial recognition is not it is not perfect, and in fact reflects a lot of biases in our society. And we know facial recognition doesn't work as well on faces of people of color as it does on somebody who looks like me. And that's a huge problem, because that means we're designing technological solutions that exacerbate existing inequities and existing inequalities. So in summary, I think that we have to be very, very careful around using 4IR technology for law enforcement. And while there's different cultural values that might determine different choices in different regions around this, coming from a North American perspective, I'm very hesitant around the sharing of private data with law enforcement. So, that's just my personal opinion there, Brett. I'm not speaking on behalf of the World Economic Forum by any means, but thank you very much for your question. Really, you kind of really went for the jugular on that one. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for that answer. And so we've got another question now. This is from an anonymous attendee, but they want to know, do we have data on IIoT return on investment by industry and by country? As you showed that, I think it was 190% from the work in Brazil. But I'm wondering if there's other similar data, and not that you've run pilots in all those other countries, and I know that you mentioned the 5 that are kind of in development, but is there any kind of existing international measurement for ROI that is being used by the World Economic Forum?
I think the answer to that is watch this space.
Okay.
In Brazil, our pilot program focused on a few industries. In Brazil, it happened to be around automotive components, aerospace components, agriculture, and so a few other process industries. Mining, interestingly, didn't come up in Brazil for small and medium-sized enterprises. We could debate that. I mean, Brazil has a huge mining industry, as everyone knows, but it just didn't happen to come up in our particular pilot. Part of the reason of that, anonymous attendee, is because mining companies tend to be quite large, and so they didn't fall under the purview of our SME project. That being said, our South Africa project is going to have mining as one of its target industries. And I think our Saudi Arabia project might as well. We're still kind of scoping that one out. So at the end of these pilot projects, I hope when we do this presentation at IIoT World 2022, I'll be able to show the results of these different pilot projects by region and by industry. So that would be a great, I would say watch this space. In terms of like other benchmarks, we probably use the same resources that other folks in the industry do. The professional service firms and the thought leadership that they publish, and obviously some, other research firms like IoT Analytics and stuff like that. Interesting just around mining industry. I also kind of, in a previous life, geeked out in the mining IoT industry for a little bit. So anonymous attendee, if you want to ping any more specific questions about mining, once we get through these others, if we have time, I'd be happy to take them.
Thanks. Now we got a question from Fabio about how the impact of the industrial IoT ROI on earnings. And if you've got any sense of what the EBITDA impact is on these industrial companies.
That's a great question. I don't have I wouldn't be able to tell you how accretive to EBITDA each pilot was off the top of my head. I just don't, Fabio, I really apologize. I just don't have that data handy. I can make some assumptions that it was highly accretive, or at least, materially accretive because of that 80% uptake, right? That 80% of our pilot project or pilot partners said, we're going to invest even further in IoT. And they wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't hitting the bottom line and really, in a meaningful way. It might be that the pilots that we ran, because the pilots themselves tended to be pretty lightweight or small IoT interventions, putting a vibration sensor on one bottleneck piece of equipment in one of your production lines, for example, to just kind of dip the toe into industrial IoT, perhaps from a sort of the order of magnitude of impact of the pilot might not have been all that much, but I would imagine that they wouldn't be investing further if they didn't see that potential impact. If I were to really, I could go back to some of our partners on the project and dig into that a little bit further, Fabio, but apologies, I'm not going to have that answer for you right now.
Yeah, no problem. And I should just mention, we asked where people were from. So I did get a couple of answers. Alexandropolis in Greece, and also uh, uh, Heidelberg in Germany. So a shout out to you both. I would also mention that we're got a drawing for the most active participants. So you get a 1-year membership to the VIP community if you're actively asking questions, although I don't think this group seems to need that. We have a question from Dora about, you mentioned the white paper, Accelerating the Impact of Industrial IoT in Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. So you mentioned that as part of the expert support availability, open source tools, and the examples included the maturity assessment tools, implementation roadmaps, reference architecture, and procurement guides. Are those resources also going to be available to non-SMEs?
I mean, those resources are available to everyone. So in fact, I could, after this, see if I can plug in the chat. Hold on, how do I have to
Yeah, if you go to the
manage
chat, you can
multiple
put in,
slides
if
here?
you've got a URL that you want to share.
Great, yeah, I'm gonna stop my screen share. So you guys are now stuck with seeing Jeff and I live. I will put, if I can get this, IoT. So here in the chat, I will put the link to that resource if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. And if you just scroll down, those resources, by the way, are in English, not in Portuguese. But if you want Portuguese, just let me know, and we got that too. And we'll be translating it into more languages shortly.
Okay, fantastic. I am going to just repeat that for all panelists and attendees.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so you guys will be able to see that. That's the link, the ipt.br link.
Yeah, and that's hosted by IPT, which is a institute in the University of Sao Paulo, who is one of our key kind of project partners, and they created the microsite for this project. Dora, I will also put the white paper in, a link to the white paper here if you're interested. I see it seems like you read it, but I want to make sure other folks have a chance to as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So we've got another question, and this one comes from Christian, who wants to know the status of industrial IoT in Eastern Europe, if you have any comment on that.
Oh, Christian, you stumped me on that one. Apologies. My experience in industrial IoT in Eastern Europe is, what's the word I would use? Incidental. I couldn't give you off the top of, I apologize, but I can't give you a sort of academically rigorous or statistically significant perspective on that. I can tell you that one of the most advanced mines I ever went to back in my days as a management consultant was in Eastern Europe, and I will. The name of the mine is unfortunately escaping me right now, but I will try to dig that out before the end of our hour.
Thanks. So I now have a question from Chris Brannock, who talks about, you mentioned asset tracking as the third most common use case. And Chris says that they found that asset data specifically around potential warranty recovery illustrates a strong ROI in general, once past the IoT visualization stage. But they're curious to hear more about what type of ROI these pilots found. Can you dig a bit deeper?
Yeah, bear with me, Chris. I'm just reading your question, so I really grok this.
And while Jeff is doing that, I'll just thank everybody for all the great questions so far. Keep them coming. We have another 5 minutes left, so we'll try and get in as many as we can. And those that we can't answer here, we'll try and answer in social media.
So Chris, I apologize. I'm not entirely tracking your question here. However, I'm curious to hear more about what type of ROI these pilots found. Can you dive a bit deeper? So, I think, sorry, I'm sort of tracking, a lot of the ROI that we saw, particularly related to asset tracking, was around inventory management and debottlenecking. In part, that was because a number of our pilot projects or pilot partners, pardon me, were automotive and aerospace component suppliers, like tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, and they were kind of using it to enhance their kind of just-in-time delivery, lower their inventory, the need to hold on to inventory, lower their raw material costs as a result. So that was kind of one of the main aspects that we saw. Chris, I hope I'm answering your question sufficiently. And if not, then feel free to follow up with me more directly.
Yeah, and now we have a question from Bjarn, who asks, can universities help use cloud API open standards, or is that the task for the local SME or else large international companies?
I guess my perspective on this is that this is for everybody. Creating more standardization, whether it's for cloud integration and APIs, or whether it's at different aspects of the IoT tech stack. I think it's incumbent on, yes, universities and researchers. Yes, it's incumbent upon the users to kind of know what to ask for, but it's also incumbent upon big business and the big suppliers to harmonize their efforts. And so I think that standardization is really a multi-stakeholder problem, and so that would be my sort of response to that.
Great. So now we have a question from Massimo, who asks, what do you think of the possible effects of IoT standards, particularly on adoption by SMEs? I'm thinking of standards like 1M2M that has recently been adopted by India as a national standard.
I think it's great. I think standards they reduce barriers to entry. Particularly from a customer perspective, it reduces complexity. It simplifies the supply chains. Like, what do I think of the possible effects of IoT standards? I think that it has the potential to the more we can standardize, the more we can accelerate adoption, and the kind of more we can chip away at the walled gardens that lead to sort of oligarchic economics in this space. The challenge is incentives, is that OEMs don't always want to open up, their differentiating features and agree to those standards. But we've seen some great progress. 1M2M is a great example. I think the Zigbee Alliance is like another example. I work a little bit with the Industrial IoT Consortium, where they're trying to work on, a different approach to standards. And yeah, Massimo, I hope that sort of answers your question around the possible effects of standards.
Great, thank you for that. And yeah, I'm looking at the clock here, and I think we are just about out of time here. So I want to thank you again, Jeff, for your great insights. This has been a fantastic session, and we will get to as many questions as we can offline. So thanks for the insights. And as a reminder, the session has been recorded and will be available on demand over the next couple of days. Our next session is Edge Computing and Artificial Intelligence. This concludes this session, and we'll see you in the next one. And also, we're doing a session on Clubhouse at 3 p.m. PST, 6 p.m. EST, and whatever that is, or elsewhere around the world. So thank you again, and we will see you again at the next session. Take care.